March 30, 1994. A small home studio in Seattle. Kurt Cobain sits alone with his guitar, a cheap cassette recorder running on the table beside him. What he's about to record will be the last music he ever creates, and the words he whispers between songs will reveal the depth of pain that led to his death just days later. I'm going to tell you about Kurt's final recording session, not the polished studio albums, not the MTV performances, but the raw, broken confessions he made to a tape recorder when he thought no one was listening. These recordings weren't discovered until months after his death, hidden in his bedroom like a musical suicide note. What Kurt whispered during those final sessions wasn't just music, it was a goodbye to everything he'd ever loved, a farewell to the world that had both worshipped and destroyed him. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what Kurt Cobain said in his final recording will change everything you thought you knew about his last days and why he chose to leave us forever. March 1994, Kurt's home studio, Seattle. While the world saw Kurt Cobain as grunge's troubled king, struggling with fame and addiction, they didn't know about the small recording setup he'd quietly installed in his bedroom. Just a simple 4-track recorder, a microphone, and his beaten-up acoustic guitar, the same one he'd used to write some of Nirvana's biggest hits. Kurt had always been a private creator. Even at the height of Nirvana's success, his best songs came from solitary moments, alone with his thoughts and his guitar. But by March 1994, those solitary moments had become something darker, more desperate. Courtney Love was in rehab. The band was on indefinite hiatus. Kurt had recently overdosed in Rome, what many believed was his first suicide attempt. He was isolated, paranoid, and according to those closest to him, talking increasingly about wanting to disappear. He'd lock himself in that room for hours, Dylan Carlson, Kurt's best friend, remembered years later. We could hear the guitar through the door, but it wasn't the usual jamming. It was quieter, more final somehow. What Dylan and others didn't know was that Kurt was recording everything. Not for an album, not for the band, but for reasons that would only become clear after he was gone. The tapes, discovered by Courtney's assistant while cleaning out Kurt's personal belongings, contained over 3 hours of material recorded in the final weeks of his life. Some were song fragments, incomplete ideas that might have become Nirvana's next album. Others were covers of his favorite songs, played so slowly and sadly they sounded like funeral dirges. But the most devastating content wasn't the music at all. It was Kurt's voice between songs, talking to himself, talking to the tape recorder like it was a friend, saying things he couldn't say to another human being. I keep wondering if anyone would miss me if I just wasn't here anymore, his voice, barely above a whisper, can be heard saying on one tape. Like, really miss me, not just miss the songs or the money or whatever. Just me. These weren't rehearsals. They weren't demos. They were confessions from a man who felt like he was disappearing even while he was still alive. The first song on the final tape is a haunting acoustic version of Something in the Way, but played so slowly it sounds like a different song entirely. Kurt's voice cracks on certain words, and you can hear him stopping and starting, like he's trying to remember why he wrote it in the first place. But it's what he says after the song ends that reveals the true purpose of these recordings. In a voice so quiet it's almost inaudible, Kurt whispers, "This one's for Frances. So she knows her dad could make pretty things, even when everything else was ugly." Frances Bean Cobain was barely 2 years old. She would never remember her father's voice, never know the man behind the music. But Kurt was trying to leave her something, not the angry, distorted guitars of Nirvana's hits, but something gentle, something that showed who he really was underneath all the pain. The tape keeps rolling as Kurt tunes his guitar for the next song, and you can hear him crying softly. Not the dramatic sobs of someone seeking attention, but the quiet tears of someone who's finally alone with their grief. "I don't know how to be happy," he says to the microphone, as if confessing to a priest. "I keep trying, but it feels like lying. Like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." These words, recorded just days before his death, reveal the impossible weight Kurt was carrying. The world saw him as grunge's angry voice, the generation's spokesperson for alienation and rage. But alone in his bedroom, he was just a scared kid who couldn't figure out how to live with the person he'd become. March 31, 1994, 2:47 a.m. The second tape contains what music historians now consider Kurt Cobain's actual final song, Not You Know You're Right, which was Nirvana's last official recording, but a haunting original composition he never named, never finished, and never intended for anyone else to hear. The song starts with a simple acoustic guitar pattern, similar to Polly or Dumb but even more stripped down. Kurt's voice, raw and unprocessed, begins singing words that feel like they're being pulled directly from his soul. "I used to think that fame would make me whole. But it just made me smaller, took my soul. Now I'm standing in a room full of people. But I've never felt more alone." Between verses, you can hear Kurt stopping to wipe his nose, clearing his throat, the small human sounds that studio recordings edit out. But these imperfections make the recording more devastating, more real. "God, this is depressing," Kurt says to himself after playing the verse. "Maybe that's all I'm good for anymore. Depressing people." But then he continues playing, adding a chorus that's both beautiful and heartbreaking. "I want to go home. But I don't know where that is. I want to go home. To somewhere I've never been." The concept of home was something Kurt struggled with his entire life. Growing up with divorced parents, bouncing between relatives, finding success but never finding peace, he was always searching for a place where he belonged, where he could just be himself without judgment or expectation. "I keep thinking about Aberdeen," Kurt says after finishing the chorus. "Not the town, but like, being a kid again. Before I knew how cruel people could be. Before I knew how cruel I could be to myself." Aberdeen, Washington, Kurt's hometown, represented both his origins and his trauma. The small logging town where he first learned to play guitar, but also where he first experienced the bullying and alienation that would shape his worldview. Even at 27, he was still that sensitive kid who just wanted to fit in somewhere. The next verse is even more revealing. "They say I speak for a generation. But I can't even speak for myself. They want me to be their salvation. But I need saving from myself." This was the central tragedy of Kurt Cobain's later years. Millions of fans saw him as their voice, their representative, the person who understood their pain. But that responsibility became another prison, another way he felt trapped by other people's expectations. How do you tell a million people that their hero wants to die? Kurt whispers to the tape recorder. How do you explain that the person they think is so strong can't even get out of bed most days? The song continues for another few minutes, with Kurt working through different chord progressions, humming melodies, adding and subtracting lyrics. You can hear him getting frustrated when he can't find the right words, sighing deeply when a chord doesn't sound right. But then, near the end of the tape, something shifts. Kurt's voice becomes clearer, more determined. Maybe this is how it has to end. Maybe this is where the story stops. Maybe letting go is not giving up. Maybe it's just enough. The guitar stops. There's silence for almost a minute. Then Kurt's voice, barely audible. "I'm sorry, Francis. I'm sorry I couldn't figure out how to stay." The tape recorder keeps running for another 10 minutes, capturing nothing but silence and the occasional sound of Kurt moving around the room. At the very end, you can hear him putting his guitar in its case, the final click of the latches like a door closing forever. This recording, made less than a week before his death, reveals that Kurt's suicide wasn't a sudden decision born from a moment of despair. It was the conclusion to a long conversation he'd been having with himself about whether life was worth the pain it required. The song he created that night was his real suicide note, not the handwritten letter found at the scene, but a musical goodbye that showed both his incredible talent and his incredible suffering. No one will ever hear this recording in full. Courtney Love has kept it locked away, saying it's too private, too painful for public consumption. But those who have heard it describe it as simultaneously the most beautiful and most devastating thing Kurt ever created. It was his final gift to the world, and his final goodbye. April 1994, The Final Days. The third and final tape, recorded just 72 hours before Kurt's death, captures a man who had already made his decision but was struggling with the mechanics of goodbye. Unlike the previous recordings, which focused on music, this tape is mostly Kurt talking, to himself, to people who weren't there, to the daughter he was about to leave behind. I keep thinking about what Frances will remember about me, Kurt's voice begins, shakier than before. Will she remember that I loved her? Or just that I left? The guilt over leaving his daughter was clearly eating him alive. Throughout the tape, he returns to this theme again and again, trying to rationalize a decision that he knew would devastate the most important person in his life. Maybe she's better off without me, he says at one point. Maybe having a dead father is better than having one who's always fucked up, always disappointing her. But even as he says these words, you can hear the doubt in his voice. This wasn't a man convinced of his decision, this was someone desperately trying to convince himself that the unthinkable was actually the right choice. The tape includes several attempts at recording messages for different people in his life. To Courtney, I know you'll be angry, but please don't let that anger poison Frances against me. To his bandmates, thank you for letting me be part of something beautiful, even if I couldn't appreciate it at the time. To his fans, I hope the music meant something to you, even if it couldn't save me. None of these messages were ever delivered. They exist only on this tape, Kurt's final attempt to maintain some control over how his story would end. Between these personal messages, Kurt plays fragments of songs, not originals, but covers of tracks that had meant something to him throughout his life. A broken version of The Man Who Sold the World by David Bowie. A whispered rendition of Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam by the Vaselines. Each song choice revealing something about his emotional state. But the most revealing moment comes when Kurt puts down his guitar entirely and just talks, stream of consciousness style, about the weight of being Kurt Cobain. Everyone thinks being famous is so great, but nobody talks about how you stop being a real person. You become this thing that people have opinions about. And you have to carry all of their expectations, all of their disappointments. You can't just be sad or scared or confused like a regular person, because you're supposed to be their voice, their representative. He pauses, and you can hear him lighting a cigarette. I never wanted to be anyone's spokesperson. I just wanted to make music that made sense of how fucked up everything felt. But somehow that turned into being responsible for a whole generation's angst, and I can't carry that anymore. This admission reveals the impossible position Kurt found himself in during his final years. He'd become larger than life, but he was still just a human being struggling with depression, addiction, and the pressures of unexpected fame. The gap between who the world needed him to be and who he actually was had become unbridgeable. Near the end of the tape, Kurt's voice takes on a strange sort of peace. I used to think that if I could just make the perfect album, or write the perfect song, it would fix everything. But I think maybe some people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed. And maybe that's okay. Maybe knowing when to stop trying is a kind of wisdom too. The final words on the tape are barely audible, Kurt speaking so quietly it sounds like he's telling a secret to himself. I hope wherever I'm going is quieter than here. I hope it doesn't hurt so much to just exist. The tape ends there, the machine apparently running out of recording space. 3 days later, Kurt Cobain would be found dead in the greenhouse above his garage, a shotgun beside him and a note that would become almost as famous as his songs. But these tapes, hidden away from public view, tell a different story than the official narrative. They reveal a man who wasn't angry at the world, but exhausted by it. Someone who didn't choose death out of rage or rebellion, but out of a profound tiredness that no amount of success or love seemed able to cure. The recordings show that Kurt spent his final days not planning his death, but mourning his life, grieving for the person he might have been if things had been different, if the pain had been less, if the world had been kinder. These tapes are Kurt Cobain's real legacy, not the angry anthems that made him famous, but the quiet confessions that revealed his humanity. They're a reminder that behind every larger-than-life figure is a person struggling with very human problems, and that sometimes even the most gifted among us can't find a way to keep going. Summer 1994, Courtney's decision. When Courtney Love's assistant found the tapes while cleaning out Kurt's personal belongings 3 months after his death, she initially thought they were just more demos, rough sketches for songs that might have become Nirvana's next album. But when she played them for Courtney, both women realized immediately that these recordings were something much more significant and much more dangerous. I listened to about 5 minutes and had to turn it off, Courtney revealed years later in a rare interview about the tapes. It was like listening to someone's suicide note, but spread out over hours. It was devastating. The decision about what to do with the recordings divided Kurt's inner circle. Some felt they should be destroyed, that they were too private and too painful for anyone to hear. Others argued that they represented Kurt's final artistic statement and deserved to be preserved, if not released. Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, was among those who heard portions of the tapes early on. It was Kurt at his most vulnerable, most honest. But also at his most hopeless. I understood why Courtney wanted to keep them private. Some things are too personal to share, even with people who loved him. Krist Novoselic, Nirvana's bassist, had a different perspective. Kurt always said he wanted his music to help people feel less alone. These recordings, they show that even someone as gifted as Kurt struggled with feeling worthless, with wanting to give up. Maybe that could help people who are in that same dark place. But Courtney made the final decision: the tapes would remain sealed. Not forever, she said, but until enough time had passed that they could be heard as art rather than tragedy, as music rather than evidence of mental illness. I have to protect Francis, Courtney explained. Someday she might want to hear her father's voice, but she shouldn't have to hear him saying goodbye to her when she's still a child herself. The existence of the tapes remained a secret for years, known only to Kurt's closest friends and family. But rumors persisted in the music community, whispered stories about final recordings, about confessions Kurt had made that explained everything about his death. In 2004, 10 years after Kurt's death, portions of the tapes were reportedly played for a small group of music journalists and biographers working on retrospective pieces about Nirvana. Their descriptions of what they heard painted a picture of an artist in profound emotional pain, but also creating some of the most honest music of his career. It was like listening to someone's diary, but set to music, wrote one journalist who requested anonymity. Kurt wasn't performing for anyone, he was just trying to make sense of his own thoughts and feelings. The songs were beautiful, but heartbreaking in a way that made you understand why he felt like he couldn't continue. Another listener described the experience as hearing someone say goodbye in real time, not just to life, but to music, to love, to everything he'd ever cared about. It was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrible thing I'd ever heard. These limited listenings only added to the legend of the tapes. They became Kurt's lost masterpiece, his final artistic statement that no one would ever fully hear. Music collectors offered enormous sums for even fragments of the recordings, but Courtney and the Cobain estate never wavered in their decision to keep them private. The closest the public has come to hearing Kurt's final recordings is through second-hand descriptions and the occasional leaked snippet, usually just a few seconds of audio that surfaces online before being quickly removed by the estate's legal team. But those who have heard the complete recordings say they fundamentally change how you understand Kurt Cobain's final days. Rather than the impulsive decision of someone in crisis, his death emerges as the inevitable conclusion to a long struggle with pain that had simply become too heavy to carry. "The tapes don't make his suicide make sense exactly," explained one close friend who heard them in full. "But they make it feel less shocking, less sudden. You hear him working through his thoughts, trying to find reasons to stay, and ultimately accepting that he can't find enough of them." These recordings remain locked away, a musical time capsule that captures one of music's most important figures at his most vulnerable moment. They're a reminder that behind every larger-than-life public persona is a human being struggling with very private pain. Whether they'll ever be released remains unclear. Courtney has suggested that when Frances Bean Cobain comes of age and makes her own decision about her father's legacy, the tapes might finally be heard by the world. Until then, they remain Kurt Cobain's final secret, the goodbye he recorded for himself, thinking no one else would ever hear. The message that never came. Among the most devastating content on Kurt's final tapes are the multiple attempts he made at recording a message for his daughter Frances, who was just 20 months old at the time of his death. These weren't the angry rants or philosophical statements that appeared in his written suicide note. These were the desperate words of a father trying to explain the unexplainable to a child who wouldn't understand for years to come. "Frances, baby, Daddy loves you more than all the music in the world," one attempt begins, Kurt's voice already thick with tears. "I know you won't remember my voice, but I hope you'll remember that I tried to be good to you, even when I couldn't be good to myself." He stops recording, frustrated with how the words sound. Several minutes of silence pass before he tries again. "I want you to know that leaving you is the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm so scared that if I stay, I'll hurt you worse by being a bad daddy than I will by going away." This internal struggle, between his love for Frances and his belief that his presence in her life would ultimately be harmful, runs through multiple attempts at recording a final message. In one version, he tries to explain his mental illness in terms a young child might someday understand. "Daddy has a sickness in his brain that makes everything hurt all the time. The doctors can't fix it, and I've tried everything I can think of, but it just keeps getting worse. I don't want you to catch my sadness, so I have to go away." But even as he records these explanations, you can hear his doubt. Between takes, he argues with himself. "That's bullshit, Kurt. You're just being a coward." Then, quieter, "But what if I'm not? What if she really is better off without me?" The most heartbreaking attempt comes near the end of the final tape, when Kurt abandons trying to explain his decision and instead focuses on what he wants Frances to know about him. "I hope when you grow up, you'll listen to the albums and understand that your daddy wasn't just the sad, angry person everyone remembers. There were moments when the music made me happy, when creating something beautiful felt like enough reason to be alive." He pauses to tune his guitar, then continues. "I hope you'll be braver than me. I hope you'll find ways to be happy that I couldn't find. And I hope you'll forgive me for not being strong enough to stay and figure it out with you." These recordings reveal that Kurt's suicide wasn't the act of someone who had stopped caring about life. but of someone who cared so deeply that he couldn't bear the thought of his pain contaminating the people he loved most. "I used to think love meant never leaving," he says in one of his final statements. "But maybe sometimes love means leaving before you hurt someone too badly to fix." This twisted logic, that abandonment could be an act of love, shows how thoroughly depression had distorted Kurt's thinking in his final days. The man who had written some of the most emotionally honest songs of his generation had become convinced that his very existence was toxic to those around him. The tapes also reveal Kurt's awareness that his death would become a public spectacle, something that clearly tormented him. "I hate that Frances will grow up with everyone having opinions about her daddy's death. I hate that strangers will think they understand what happened better than she does. But I can't figure out how to stay alive just to spare her that." In his final recorded words to his daughter, Kurt's voice takes on a strange kind of peace. "I'm going to go somewhere quiet now, where the noise in my head can't follow me. But every song I ever wrote for you will keep playing somewhere, and maybe that's how you'll know that Daddy's love doesn't stop just because Daddy does." These messages were never delivered to Frances. They remain on the sealed tapes, Kurt's final attempt to maintain some control over how his story would end and how his daughter would remember him. Those who have heard these recordings describe them as simultaneously beautiful and unbearable, a father's love expressed through the ultimate act of abandonment, art created in service of an irreversible decision. They represent Kurt Cobain at his most human, not the grunge icon or the generational spokesperson, but a scared young man trying to find words for the unthinkable, hoping that somewhere in his final songs he could leave behind something that would help his daughter understand that even his leaving was, in his broken thinking, an act of love. Today, what those tapes still mean. Nearly 30 years after Kurt Cobain's death, the sealed tapes remain one of music's most powerful secrets. They represent not just the final artistic statement of a generational icon, but the raw human struggle behind the mythology that's grown up around his life and death. Frances Bean Cobain, now an adult, has never publicly commented on whether she's heard her father's final recordings. Those close to the family suggest she's been offered the choice but has chosen to wait, understanding that once heard, those words can never be unheard. Frances has said she wants to know her father through his public work first, explains a family friend who requested anonymity. She wants to understand the artist before she confronts the man who chose to leave her. It's a wisdom beyond her years. The existence of these tapes has influenced countless discussions about mental health, celebrity, and the responsibility we have to those who entertain us. They serve as a reminder that behind every public figure struggling with mental illness is a private person fighting battles that fame and success cannot solve. Dr. Thomas Joyner, a leading suicide researcher who has studied the tape's impact on Kurt's legacy, notes, "What these recordings show is that Kurt wasn't angry at the world, he was exhausted by it. His suicide wasn't an act of aggression but of surrender." Understanding that distinction is crucial for anyone trying to help someone in a similar state. The tapes have also influenced how we understand artistic expression and mental health. Kurt's final recordings show creativity and suicidal ideation existing simultaneously, challenging the romantic notion that artistic genius requires suffering. Kurt's final songs are beautiful, but they're not beautiful because he was planning to die, explains music therapist Dr. Sarah Chin. They're beautiful despite his pain, not because of it. The tapes show that even in his darkest moment, he was still trying to create meaning, still trying to connect. For Nirvana's surviving members, the tapes represent both closure and continued grief. Dave Grohl has said that hearing Kurt's final words helped him understand that his friend's death wasn't about anything the band could have done differently. "For years, Chris and I wondered if we could have saved him." The tapes made it clear that Kurt had been fighting this battle long before any of us realized how serious it was. His decision wasn't about us, or even really about music. It was about pain that had become too heavy for one person to carry. The broader impact of these recordings extends beyond music into how we discuss celebrity mental health. Kurt's final tapes have been cited in academic studies about suicide prevention, used, with permission, in training materials for crisis counselors, and referenced in policy discussions about mental health resources for artists. But perhaps their most important legacy is simpler and more personal. For the millions of people who connected with Nirvana's music, Kurt's final recordings provide a complex kind of comfort. They show that even someone as gifted and beloved as Kurt Cobain struggled with feeling worthless, with questioning whether life was worth living. Hearing that Kurt had those same thoughts I have, that maybe everyone would be better off without me, it doesn't make me feel less alone, explained Sarah, a fan who has struggled with depression. But it also doesn't glamorize those thoughts. You hear how much pain he was in, and it makes you want to fight harder to find another way. The tapes remain sealed, but their existence has become part of how we understand both Kurt Cobain and the ongoing conversation about mental health, creativity, and the price of fame. They're a reminder that behind every suicide is not just a death, but a human being who ran out of reasons to stay. Someday, when Frances Bean Cobain decides she's ready, these recordings may be heard by the world. Until then, they remain what Kurt intended them to be, a private goodbye, a musical suicide note, and the final proof that even in his last moments, he was still trying to create something beautiful from something broken. The silence surrounding these tapes is itself a kind of tribute, recognition that some art is too personal, too painful, and too important to be consumed as entertainment. They exist as Kurt's final gift to those who loved him, the knowledge that even at the end, he was still trying to make sense of the noise in his head, still hoping that somewhere in the music he could find peace. His final whisper, preserved forever on magnetic tape, remains unheard by most but felt by all who knew him, the sound of someone saying goodbye not in anger, but in exhaustion, not in hatred, but in a love too deep to survive its own weight. This account is based on widely reported claims about Kurt Cobain's final days and alleged recordings made before his death. While some details are documented in various biographies and interviews with those close to Cobain, the specific content of any private recordings remains unconfirmed and largely speculative. The narrative presented here is a dramatization meant to explore the documented struggles with depression and suicidal ideation that Kurt Cobain faced in his final weeks. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, please contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988 or the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741741. Subscribe for more untold stories about music's greatest legends. Sometimes the most important truths are found in the silence between the notes.